But friends, do you remember the Zelensky curse? May 2023, Zelensky visits Bakhmut. December 2023, Zelensky goes to Avdiivka. And as part of the latest iteration, on the 18th of November 2024, Ukrainian President Zelensky went to Kupyansk. Knowing his track record, we all know what's going to happen. Here from Ukrainska Pravda, the Russians are getting closer and closer to Kupyansk. We will talk about this very interesting article later in the video. This is what 24 Canal wrote. According to Estonian intelligence, Russia's plans are ruined. I'll just show you the map and you'll decide for yourself. This was the situation on the Luhansk front in early September. And this is the situation now, 3 months later. A couple more ruined plans like that and the Russian army will be in Kiev. At this moment, Russian forces have reached the Oskol river. That's how they caught the fortress city of Kupyansk and its garrison in a semi-encirclement. And let's be honest, nobody's excited when they're caught in a semi. Meanwhile, further south, 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers are holding back an entire Russian tank army. Despite their best efforts, they're slowly forced to give up ground, but every step is contested as they seek to delay the advancing force. And at this rate, it's the city of Borova that will also find itself cornered.
Fuck.
2 days after Zelensky visited Kupyansk, Radio Free Europe interviewed some Ukrainian soldiers positioned in and around the besieged city. Put simply, their morale is pretty low. Actually, just check out what they had to say.
Зараз ніхто не хоче йти. Не знаю, трохи в суспільстві думка змінилася. Зняти з 22-м роком. Трохи є, звісно, образливо, то що дивишся, в людей як будто війни немає.
Now many Ukrainian soldiers are asking themselves,
Why do we force?
and nobody can give them an answer. Especially when they see that on social media, everyone else, all their buddies are living their best life and partying like no tomorrow, while they're stuck in frozen and muddy trenches under enemy artillery fire. From an operational perspective, the Ukrainian defenders of Kupyansk can only be reinforced and supplied via pontoon bridges. But this logistics flow has been complicated with continuous Russian airstrikes on all bridges and crossing points, making the situation for the Ukrainian army extremely tenuous. So we all know about Russia's superiority and firepower, FAB bombs, artillery, but part of the Russian army's success can also be explained by purity seals. That's right, the same ones inspired by the game Warhammer 40k that Russian soldiers now wear in combat. For maximum damage points, these purity seals were blessed by the church, and of course the prayers were changed for Psalm 90. If you're wondering how I keep up with all the political news related to the Ukraine war, it's because I used this app and website by Ground News for my research. I found this interesting story. Zelensky open to Western troops providing security for end to war in Ukraine. Ground News found over 458 articles covering this story. It immediately shows us how much of the coverage was politically left-leaning, how much was on the right, and how many sources were rated as relatively neutral. As you can see, this is a great tool for my research. You can also access Ground News by using my link, ground.news/HistoryLegends, to access the Vantage plan, and they're offering 50% off right now. Another feature of Ground News that I really like is the bias comparison tool. In one simple click, you can get a summary of what both the left and the right report. And if you don't have much time, just click here on bias comparison. We learned that the left employs emotionally charged language like the madness, highlighting Ukraine's heavy losses and the needs for an urgent peace, reflecting a dire tone, while the center is positioning Trump as a decisive leader, whereas the right emphasizes Zelensky's openness to foreign troops, reflecting a strategic pivot, which is not emphasized in the left and the center. On top of that, if you want to learn more, you can select similar news topics that you are the most interested in. What I also like is how when I click here, I can see what is the overall political leading of various news agencies. Another interesting feature is how I can filter articles. Let's say I want an article that is politically at the center with high or very high factuality. And no paywall, so I can read it easily. Amazing, we got 24 articles to choose from. Personally, as someone fascinated by warfare and geopolitics, Ground News is an invaluable tool that cuts through the noise. Ground News is giving my viewers 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year and it will only be available for a limited time. If you're already a subscriber, you can send Ground News as a gift for 50% off as well. So make sure you use my link in the description below. I think Ground News is doing important work and I hope you'll check them out. Not only will you support the headquarters, but you'll also support a small team looking to hold the media accountable. To fully understand the critical situation our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia found itself, we have to go back to early September. At that moment, the Ukrainian command in Kupyansk faced several problems. First of all, this bulge that was quickly expanding and ready to release right onto the Oskol river. Number two, then there were many small salients to defend. For example, look at the one south of Pishchane. Or what about this salient on the east bank of the Zherebets river, between the villages of Makivka and Terny? Overall, 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers defended the Luhansk front, 5,000 in and around Kupyansk, and another 10,000 further south along the Oskol reservoir. Another dilemma for Ukraine was how to supply their forces positioned on the east bank of the Oskol river. In this footage, you have the Russian Air Force firing an X-38 air-to-surface missile on one of the bridges. In response, the main strategic nodes for the Ukrainian army are the cities of Kupyansk and Liman further to the south, which allow them to continuously supply friendly forces. Because of that, the Russians continued their intense aerial bombardment campaign of both objectives. For example, here in Kupyansk, you can see some sort of warehouse, and here's the same building after a Russian missile strike. Another area the Russian Air Force heavily bombarded is Pietropavlivka, a town located on the eastern outskirts of Kupyansk. And once again, look at the terrible destruction that follows such airstrikes. Meanwhile, further south in Liman, you have this large industrial area near this marshalling yard. You can see it's the same area both on the map and on the video. And look at the state of the factory after the fall of an FAB 500 bomb.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
On the 5th of September, the Russian army started out by clearing some of the smaller salients south of Pishchane. As you can see in this footage, most of the Ukrainian soldiers positioned there are just hidden in makeshift dugouts and bunkers, which can hardly be called fortifications. Meanwhile, the few actual bastions there are in this sector are just crushed by TOS-1A Saltsepiok flamethrowers. Meanwhile, further to the rear, a Ukraine mortar pit was detected and then destroyed by Russian drones. After a week of relative calm on the Luhansk front, on the 12th of September, Russian assault units advanced 800 meters west of Pishchane. However, the same day, the Russians also made moves further to the south. As you can see, they captured almost the entire settlement of Makivka. In this video, you can see a Storm assault squad clearing one of the Ukrainian trench systems around the village. There was also this drone footage recorded by the Ukrainian 66th Mechanized Brigade, which supposedly showed a field littered with fallen enemy soldiers. I counted about 80 fatalities. Now, their claim is that all these are, of course, Russian soldiers. Press X for doubt. In reality, it's impossible to verify. I mean, obviously the losses are heavy, but most likely it's a mix of both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. Over the span of multiple weeks, on the 14th of September, Russian forces renewed their offensive north of Kupyansk. After clearing the first outposts, where Ukrainian soldiers have been edging for so long, the Russians stormed Sinkivka and secured half the settlement. At the same time, another detachment advanced north of Pishchane. From their forward positions along the tree line, they mopped up enemy leftovers on both flanks. As a follow-up, they got a foothold in this tree line. From there, they pushed 1 kilometer along these 3 tree lines, which are used like attack lanes or communication trenches, after which the Russians captured this 4-kilometer long tree line. This attack created a 5-kilometer wide salient north of Tabaivka that the Russians now tried to clear. One storm detachment near Kislivka tried to flank Ukrainian lines from this forest, but they were halted by swarms of FPV drones. Interestingly, in this Ukrainian drone footage, we can even see where this Russian unit regrouped in this forested area. Possibly 100 soldiers were concentrated there. As the drone approached, more and more white dots could be detected. As the drone was ready to strike, that's when the drone operator lost control over his FPV drone because of hidden Russian electronic warfare capabilities. That's where a good old artillery strike would have done the job. Additionally, what's worrying for the Ukrainians is that we know they're already low on artillery pieces. But in this video from that same Kupyansk area, we see a Russian drone strike on one of the few remaining Ukrainian 152mm 2A65 MSTB towed howitzers. On the 21st of September, Russian armored units advanced 2.5 kilometers towards the Oskol river. At this point, they were only 3,000 meters away from cutting off the Ukrainian front in two. Now the dilemma for the Ukrainian command is that they could not move troops and supplies as easily in that part of the front anymore. For example, if they had a unit in Liman and they wanted to transfer it to reinforce a position in the Kupyansk sector, they had to move them along the west bank of the Oskol river, which is much longer, and then get them to the other side of the river through one of the crossing points. But now the Russians are targeting each one of these crossing points. Here, a Russian Su-34 dropped a heavy load on this bridge over the Oskol river, one that they kept for a couple days. If we try to geolocate it, we see that there's a motor bridge, and to its side a railway bridge that is destroyed. I looked everywhere, but there was only one place along the Oskol river with a similar layout. This bridge is located 7 kilometers south of the Kupyansk city center, near the suburb of Kupyansk, Vuslovye. We see that if we put these two images side by side, it's the same place. Although notice that the pontoon bridge that was there when the satellite image was captured is not there anymore. This means because of the Russian Air Force, the railway bridge is gone, the pontoon bridge is gone, and this bridge is also gone. Additionally, in this nightmare scenario, the reinforcements that do make it across are also targeted. Here we have an M113 APC that is destroyed by a mine. The crew and the soldiers inside are then rescued by a BMP-1, which then also gets destroyed. As you can imagine, this makes the situation extremely critical for this Ukrainian grouping near Kupyansk. Check out what one of the battalion commanders of the 3rd Assault Brigade, Azov, had to say.
Ситуація важка, не контрольована насправді, тому що ворог оволодів повністю населеним пунктом Пishchane і продовжує просуватися на захід в бік лівого берегу річки Oskol. І у нього це дуже непогано виходить. Фактично до берега річки йому залишається 2 кілометри. Що це йому дає? Сили оборони України він розрізає навпіл, і логістичний маршрут, до прикладу, Борова і туди північніше, в сторону Куп'янська, вже цього логістичного маршруту не існує.
While all this was taking place in the north near Kupyansk, let's analyze what happened further south. On the 21st of September, Russian assault units of the 144th Motorized Rifle Division advanced 1,500 meters and got a foothold inside the village of Nevske. By the 24th, after 3 days of intense fighting, the Russians took control of most of the village. This breakthrough created 2 new salients for the Ukrainians on the east bank of the Zherebets river. In response, the Ukrainians launched multiple counterattacks in this sector to regain their lost positions and prevent friendly forces from being encircled. For days, settlements switched hands, but ultimately by the 30th of September, after the failure of Ukrainian units to dislodge the Russians from Nevske, the village officially came under Russian control. The slow pace of operations on the Luhansk front can be explained by 2 reasons. Number 1, the open terrain and lack of large urban areas. So it makes it very hard to concentrate forces without being detected. And number 2, in my opinion, due to the remote location of this battlefield and the lack of railway lines, which makes it hard to supply large formations. October 2024. By the 3rd of October, forward elements of the Russian army had progressed 1,200 meters towards the Oskol river. And the next day, after the arrival of reinforcements, filled up this breakthrough into a girthy bulge. Simultaneously, Russian forces stormed Stelmachivka, In this video you can see men of the Orech Company, 2nd Battalion, 37th Motor Rifle Brigade, raising their banner on the settlement, or rather whatever was left of it.
King in the castle, king in the castle.
At the same time, another Russian unit captured the hamlet of Andriivka. This latest move created new cauldrons for the Ukrainians, which they would have to plan their escape from. By the 5th of October, the Ukrainian command already started ordering some units to fall back. In this video, we can see how a Ukrainian APC carrying out a rotation was ambushed by a grenade-dropping drone. And you know how it goes, the mobics stay in place, while the more valuable units are pulled out first. And then the Ukrainian command is like, "Blet, I do not understand why everybody's deserting." Meanwhile, heavy fighting also took place in the Nevske Makivka sector, as Russian armored columns tried to break through the weakened Ukrainian lines. But they were stopped by the rapid counterattack of the 4th Mechanized Battalion of the Burevy Presidential Brigade. As a matter of fact, it's the same brigade that I brought up in my Velika Novosilka video, but there's the 3rd Mechanized and 20th Special Forces battalions that are deployed. The two units are 180 kilometers apart. Goes to show how the Ukrainian command manages its forces. Anyway, in one of these Russian assaults, Ukrainian drone operators struck 2 tanks, 2 BMPs, 1 BTR, and even 1 TOS Tseltsepyok. In Makivka, Russian recon units took position on one of the heights overlooking the village. In this footage, you can even see how the area looks like, where Ukrainian FPV drones are hunting for enemy soldiers hidden along the slopes. Let's check out what Ukrainian newspaper Zerkalo Nedeli had to say, or Mirror of the Week. The Russians are changing their assault tactics in the Liman-Kupyansk direction. Essentially, Russian forces have assault groups of 10 people each, which then split into 2 groups of 5, and then again 1 group of 2 and another of 3. We already covered these Russian infiltration tactics in a previous video. The main reason these infiltration tactics work is because Ukrainian drone operators cannot pinpoint the location of all these subunits. Mirror of the Week reported. It is also worth adding that these Russian assault groups are actively covered by their own FPV drones. Up to 5 drones fly to cover each serviceman. So in theory, an assault group of 10 men is supported by 50 drones. Overall, at this point, there were 3 Ukrainian cauldrons that faced encirclement. The one near Novovodyanne, the one between Makivka and Nevske, and the one north of Terny. Now imagine you're part of the Ukrainian HQ. What would be your battle plan? From which cauldron would you withdraw your troops first? On the 6th of October, Russian aviation launched multiple strikes on Kivsharivka. Here an FAB-500 turned an entire set of buildings to ruins. And in the next footage, you can see another set of rubble caused by these bombs. Imagine if the Ukrainian command had positioned some troops or military equipment there. On the 11th of October, this Russian Mi-24 helicopter footage was released by the MOD. But then we could see the remains from a destroyed fighter aircraft. Turns out this is a Russian aircraft that was shot down in early October 2022. There's some massive World War I vibes when you see remains of battles that took place at the same position 2 years ago. By the 14th of October, Ukrainian forces started withdrawing from this cauldron north of Nevske. 2 days later, Russian troops from the 144th Motorized Rifle Division planted their flag on buildings in the northern part of Nevske. In this video, you can even see how they proceeded. We see motorcycles driving around, but instead of dropping soldiers, we noticed they were actually creating a massive smoke screen around the entire battlefield. As you can imagine, all the smoke screens will make it very hard for Ukrainian drone operators to pinpoint the exact location of enemy forces. Then armored columns started approaching the village from multiple directions. Here we see 1 tank and 2 BMPs disembarking their riflemen, while being covered by another smoke screen. Here another BMP is releasing a smoke screen, while the infantrymen exit the vehicle right next to this house, where they will be able to find refuge. After that, multiple infantry squads swarmed the entire settlement. The Russians tried to gain momentum and accelerate the withdrawal of these Ukrainian forces with quick armored attacks. But in this case, it didn't seem to have worked, as this Russian T-80 BVM tank was destroyed by Ukrainian FPV drones. Further north, by the 17th of October, heavy fighting was taking place on key heights near Stelmachivka. This ridgeline was extremely important because if these positions fell, in no time would the Russians be in Lozova. which would create yet another cauldron for the Ukrainian army. On the 19th of October, what had to happen, happened. The Russian 1st Tank Army reached the banks of the Oskol River in Kroglyakivka after a 2-kilometer push. In this footage, you can see one of these columns composed of 7 armored vehicles driving across open field. This formation was soon ambushed by Ukrainian FPV drones coming from every direction. In the end, the Ukrainians claimed 8 BMPs and 3 tanks destroyed, as well as 6 BMPs damaged. Although the Ukrainians claimed this as a victory and yet another PR stunt, at the same time, 3 Russian armored vehicles were spotted driving around the town of Kroglyakivka. The village was effectively theirs. That means yes, the Ukrainians managed to annihilate one column, but all the others reached their objectives and called a touchdown. However, Russian forces could not yet celebrate their victory, because they had to switch from offensive to defensive mode real quick in order to repel very strong Ukrainian counterattacks. One of them was led by operatives of the Timor Special Forces unit of the HUR. This unit was redeployed from Luhansk to Kupyansk for this mission along the Oskol River. For this counterattack, they were supported by elements of the 77th Air Mobile Brigade. In this video, you can see the control room of this entire operation. This command center has a live feed of multiple drones recording the battlefield. I counted about 7 screens. In the next frame, we see a small team of Spec Ops operatives aboard pickup trucks racing to the contact line. From the footage, we see that these men are heavily equipped. There's 1 machine gun for every 3 men. Additionally, they move in a very rapid yet coordinated way, as they mop up one building after another. With this video, we can even geolocate exactly where this firefight took place. We see that these Ukrainian operatives cleared this part of Kroglyakivka and thus repelled the Russians from the Oskol River. However, this success was short-lived, since on the 20th of October, Russian reinforcements arrived and most of Kroglyakivka was now in a gray zone. While this very important battle was taking place south of Kupyansk, the Russian Army HQ also made a move in the forests north of the city. On the 19th of October, Russian rifle units pushed 2 kilometers inside these woods west of Zinkivka. Remember last time I spoke about this exact sector, how long ago it was? In this video posted by the Ukrainians, you can see how dense the forest is in this sector. This could mean that the Russian plan is indeed to push further into the forest and bypass Zinkivka. Alright, back to the report. Eventually, fighting now reached these woods on the western extremity of Petropavlivka. In this GoPro footage from the perspective of a Russian assault team, you can even get a glimpse of what the battlefield looked like. On the 20th of October, Ukrainian lines west of the Zherebets river cracked after Russian assault detachments pushed 1,700 meters from Andrivka towards Vishneve. After days of heavy fighting in Kroglyakivka and lots of back and forth, most of the town came under Russian control. The Ukrainian command now had to worry about this cauldron extending over 34 kilometers. Meanwhile, at the bottom south of the DLC map, in the Nevske Makivka sector, the drone operators of the 4th Battalion of the Presidential Brigade kept targeting exposed Russian infantry units. It's truly horrible. You literally see soldiers running for their lives from these FPV drones chasing them at full speed. Due to all these drone swarms and counterattacks, I think the Russian command in that sector pressed on the brakes, as they got overextended and expected another strike in the coming hours. The aggressive posture of the Ukrainians seems to have been beneficial, as they used this moment to pull out their forces from the various pockets north and south of Nevske, towards friendly lines on the west bank of the Zherebets river. In the end, this retrograde maneuver that required a lot of skills was completed by the 24th of October. The Russian 144th Motorized Rifle Division now controlled a 17-kilometer front along the Zherebets river, and the next day they planted the Russian flag on the village of Novosadove. I think we can attribute the Je me souviens award to this 144th Division. Do you remember that the Ukrainians captured this exact same line on the 10th of October 2022. In the end, the 154th Division held its ground and repulsed each one of these attacks. All I know is that the Russian public seems to particularly like this division, especially the commander nicknamed Métis of the 254th regiment, because apparently he went directly to the front line to make sure that his men hold the ground. And then some artists made a bunch of artwork about this event. And while the entire Russian army was melting away, it's the 144th Division that held the Kreminna sector. They stood their ground like a mountain, and thus prevented a Ukrainian breakthrough into Luhansk Oblast, and thus the entire defeat of the Russian army. And here we are 2 years later. On the 26th of October, forward elements of the Russian army pushed as far as 4 kilometers beyond Stelmachivka, and thus putting a clear dent inside this Ukrainian salient. Here you can see one of the armored columns that participated in this attack. After the lead vehicle hit a mine, all the BMPs behind quickly disembarked their rifle squads, so that they can withdraw before enemy FPV drones arrive. For the rest of the week, we saw heavy fighting take place all along this salient. Any additional kilometer gained could encircle hundreds of Ukrainian troops. For this reason, the Ukrainian command carried out quick local counterattacks with any available reserves to prevent a collapse of its defensive positions. Throughout the month of October, Russian aviation struck the crossing over the Oskol River, near Horokhovatka. In this video, we see the actual airstrike, but that's not what I wanted to show you. First of all, this is the bridge on Google Earth, but in reality, the river is much narrower these days. Using Sentinel satellite imagery, we see that in May, most of the river turned into swamps, and here we see the main bridge going over whatever was left of the river. We can explain that because a lot of these bridges were actually dams, and with their destruction it altered the size of the reservoir. By the 8th of August, the Ukrainians started building another bridge, bypassing the main one, which seems to have been completed by the 18th. And this is what we see in the video. The main bridge was struck while Ukrainian vehicles drove on the pontoon crossing. November 2024. On the 1st of November, Russian forces closed the gap, and we're now at the gates of Terny. During this Russian push, Ukrainian drone operators started harassing enemy infiltration teams that tried to get a foothold inside the village. And while this was taking place, Russian aviation responded by hammering whatever was left of Terny. 3 days later, further north, Russian army units mopped up the remaining Ukrainian positions between the Oskol River and Pishchane. At the same time, Ukrainian units still clinged on to parts of the town of Kuglyakivka, clearly demonstrating the strategic nature of this position. But things turned critical for the Ukrainians when fighting moved towards Kolesnivka. That's when the Ukrainians deployed entire UAV shock units, meant to literally swarm Russian units with hundreds of drones, like this one which somehow managed to take out and expose Russian Buk M2 air defense system. On the 5th of November, Russian assault units captured these two forested areas along this slightly elevated terrain, and from there they managed to get a foothold inside Vishneve. Some units even managed to make it into Pershotravneve. All these names seem very familiar to me. The Russians are literally about to storm the important road junction at Pershotravneve. Now if we zoom out, the Russian maneuver becomes a bit clearer. The Russians nicknamed this move the BFTER, or Big Finger Tickling Enemy Rears. And as part of the Russian art of trolling, they made sure to make it visible by NATO satellites, with a good number of its outposts compromised. By the 8th of November, the Ukrainian command withdrew from its positions north of Andrivka. That's how the Russian army managed to secure this entire portion of the Zherebets river. That river, although very narrow, was one of the last notable terrain features between the Russian army and the Oskol River on the southern part of the battlefield. The latest Russian push in Andrivka shrinked the two Ukrainian cauldrons we mentioned before, this one south of Berestove and this one north of Tabaivka. After dealing with this crossing point near Kupyansk-Voslovie, on the 10th of November, the Russian Air Force bombarded another crossing point in the same area. We see that on Sentinel, the Ukrainians built a secondary crossing. This image dates back from the 24th of October, but in the video, by the 10th of November, it is clear that this pontoon bridge had already been destroyed. How long can Ukraine sustain this rhythm of continuously rebuilding pontoon bridges? In this article by Ukrainska Pravda I showed you earlier, well, they provide us with an answer. The soldiers of the Burevi unit said, "The crossings here do not last long, a few days or weeks, after which they're precisely destroyed by Russian FABs. I think it would actually be an interesting video to analyze the work of Ukrainian engineering units, which barely anyone talks about, but whose role is extremely important. By the 12th of November, west of Kolesnikivka, it seems some Russian units infiltrated enemy lines, pushed 3.5 kilometers along this railway line, and established a bastion inside these woods. What's interesting is that the Russians now have specialized assault detachments that are immediately followed by specialized construction detachments, whose job is to literally dig in and consolidate newly captured positions. If the situation could not get worse, as the Russian army was creeping its way south of Kupyansk, all of a sudden some of their forward elements were reported right inside Kupyansk. If we zoom in, the Russians essentially managed to clear this entire forested area, but also to land some troops undetected 4 kilometers along this railway line right into the city center. Essentially what happened is that a Russian column composed of 1 tank, 1 BMP and 2 MTLB troop transports just wandered through Ukrainian lines, and since they faced no opposition, they ended up right inside Kupyansk. Although some of the armored vehicles were then destroyed, they still managed to disembark their infantry component inside the industrial zone, more specifically the metal receiving factory. Apparently they even managed to get some reinforcements, but soon they'll discover the damaging effects of being on the receiving side. The Ukrainians immediately dispatched some specialized assault units to crush this bridgehead. Completely encircled, a number of these Russian soldiers surrendered to the enemy. We see one of them in this video, and another 3 being manhandled in this footage. On the 15th of November, due to intense pressure from all sides, the Ukrainians finally abandoned their combat positions south of Berestove. But now let's go back to the southern part of the battlefield. The Ukrainian ISR department probably noticed how this area was brewing with enemy troops. A couple days later, it became clear how the Russian army was preparing for another strike. After their success in Nevske and Makivka, the Russians decided to launch an attack out of Novovodiane. However, they were stopped by elements of the elite 3rd Assault Brigade Azov. We see that the lead vehicle of this column was destroyed, which then halted the column. Then we just see 2 entire Russian rifle squads scattering away. While one group of Ukrainian drone operators finished off the armored vehicles, the others chased down all the infantrymen. No pity, they even targeted these men with cluster munition strikes. On the 19th of November, Zelensky visited Kupyansk and handed some awards to soldiers of the 14th Mechanized Brigade that have been holding this part of the front for more than a year. By the 24th of November, the Russian armed forces finally consolidated their positions in Kroglyakivka. It took them 1 month for this small town. Then they advanced 1,800 meters towards Lozova and raised their flag over the hamlet of Kopanki, which I think is famous for its Korean pancakes. This was followed by a strong Ukrainian counterattack which aimed at retaking control of the settlement. Meanwhile, Russian spearheads had already started approaching Zelensky High, now in the Makivka-Nevske-Terny sector. All along the Zherebets river, the front remained more or less stable. Not because the Russian army columns didn't try to shove it in, but because they lacked game and were denied entry. We only know it took place in that sector. We see 2 Russian armored vehicles, of which 1 BTR being pounded over and over by Ukrainian FPV drones. And in this one, which destroyed or damaged 2 BMPs. Now in this footage, what I found interesting is how the moment this BMP was hit, 11 riflemen exited the vehicle. 11! It's a lot! Actually, it's nothing special, it's just 8 riflemen plus the 3 crewmen calling GG well played on their BMP. Ukrainian battalion commander of the Presidential Guard Varkhamiev reported to Ukrainska Pravda that due to the lack of artillery, about 70% of enemy vehicles are destroyed by FPV drones, approximately 20% by remote mines, and 10% by the troops on the ground themselves. On the 30th of November, the Russians gained 2,000 meters and reached the outskirts of Lozova. Throughout November, the Ukrainians held the line relatively well. Oh yeah, and on the 25th of November, pro-Ukrainian Deep State UA also removed this Russian bridgehead inside Kupyansk. The Ukrainians were ready to celebrate borscht, blini and vodka. But before Commander Ihor could open a new bottle, terrible news arrived. That's when he dropped the bottle and it shattered on the floor. Just kidding, nobody wasted vodka. The command center still emptied the bottle just while crying. The terrible news was that 17 kilometers north of Kupyansk, the sneaky Ruskov crossed the Oskol river. At first, the bridgehead was tiny, but then it grew and it grew much bigger. More and more of these rubber boats released small teams of riflemen onto the west bank of the river. Eventually, Russian forces now threatened the village of Novomlinsk. Things got worse on the 30th of November, as another Russian grouping crossed the Oskol river in Masyutivka. Not only did they establish a solid bridgehead, they advanced 2 kilometers inland. The village of Dvorchina was getting encircled, and if it fell, then the Russians could flank Kupyansk. If you remember, we actually spoke about this exact possibility a while back. This could point towards the Ukrainians preparing for a Russian river crossing attempt near Masyutivka and Dvorchina. December 2024. Zelensky opened the advent calendar on the 1st of December hoping for a new batch of weapons. Whoops, another 2-kilometer withdrawal from this cauldron, followed the next day by another retreat of 1,200 meters. Overall, we could see that the Ukrainians were progressively withdrawing towards the Oskol River, where they would create some sort of fortified bastion around Borova. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In that sector, we also saw the Russians use a UGV or ground vehicle to blow up a Ukrainian hideout. It's kind of strange how Call of Duty called a lot of these inventions kamikaze drones, exploding ground vehicles. What's next? On the 2nd of December, it was reported that 3 Russian tanks were destroyed while trying to break through towards Kivsharivka. Now, we don't know exactly where that happened, but we see open fields with tree lines. Either they attacked from this direction or from this one. So overall, the Ukrainians managed to hold the line south of the Kupyansk pocket. Meanwhile, north of Kupyansk, Ukrainian forces formed a Kampfgruppe composed of a battalion of the 10th Mountain Brigade Edelweiss, supported by elements of the 3rd Tank Brigade, UAV squads, and artillery. In this joint effort, they counterattacked the Russian bridgeheads. In this video, we see one of the Ukrainian tanks blasting enemy positions one by one at point blank. Whereas in this other axis of progression, this Ukrainian tank opens the path for a BMP. This allowed the IFV to disembark an entire assault squad right into the tree line. The next day, by the 3rd of December, the Ukrainian Kampfgruppe managed to knock out the Russians out of the bridgehead near Novomlinsk. As you can see, Ukrainian forces then raised the blue and yellow flag on the village. I found this video released on the 4th of December, where we see a small armored unit of 3 Russian vehicles, which as usual then gets harassed by FPV drones. The report stated how it was men from the Ukrainian 114th Territorial Defense Brigade which repelled this Russian attack. And this brigade is said to be located around this part of the front, near the Zherebets river. Turns out this video was actually geolocated in the north, near Sinkivka. This probably means the Russian grouping in this sector tried to regroup and form an armored fist in order to get a definitive foothold inside Petropavlivka. And that explains why, in the same area on the 5th of December, we also witnessed a Leopard 2A4 struck by a Russian Lancet kamikaze drone. This goes to show how the Ukrainians are actually reinforcing the garrison of Kupyansk. By the 7th of December, forward elements of the Russian army reached the outskirts of Zeleny High. You know the drill, forming yet another cauldron for Ukrainian forces. 3 days later, the Russians carried out another river crossing operation, this time in the sector of Krugliakivka towards Sendove. But it seems the Ukrainians reacted quickly and pushed them back. The same day, 2 Russian armored vehicles were stopped as they pushed out of Kolesnikivka in an attempt to bypass these 3 Ukrainian strongholds positioned on their right flank. For an entire week, nothing happened, as both sides regrouped their forces for the next round. Everything remained calm until the 14th of December. North of Kupyansk, the Russians actually managed to consolidate their bridgehead on the other side of the Oskol River near Masyutivka. Even worse, they even managed to get a foothold inside Dvorchina. South of Kupyansk, thanks to the arrival of reinforcements, the Ukrainians counterattacked in Kolesnikivka and pushed the Russians back 2,000 meters and regained control of this forested bastion as well. And further south of that position, Russian assault detachments advanced 3,800 meters, creating 3 additional cauldrons for the Ukrainian army. Again! So what can we expect in the following days and weeks on the Kupyansk front? We can understand that from the Ukrainian perspective, the Oskol River is too much of a strategic position to be abandoned. Overall, I think the Ukrainians will try to counterattack in order to regain their lost positions in Kruglyakivka, but I feel this will become extremely difficult, as Russian spearheads are already bypassing Lozova and heading for the Oskol River. Now, from an operational perspective, we can believe the Ukrainians plan to withdraw their forces in a retrograde movement towards prepared defensive positions centered on Kupyansk, Borova, and Liman. In the south, the Ukrainians built this set of fortified bastions along this line going from Zherebets all the way to Borova. Even if the Russian army breaks through, Ukrainian forces will just withdraw and concentrate around Borova, where they will actively hold this bridgehead and find ways to supply it. That's why at this rate, we can expect the Russian armed forces to make the most gains in this sector. Same principle for the north in Kupyansk. The most dangerous maneuver for the Ukrainians would be that the Russians, in a pincer maneuver, simply slide through the Oskol River and reach the city proper. But looking at the latest counterattacks, I think that the Ukrainians prevented this scenario from happening. This will allow Ukrainian forces to slowly retreat towards the set of fortifications whose outer ring is centered on Petropavlivka, followed by a second line inside Kupyansk proper. Even if all these positions end up falling, just like we've seen in Vovchansk, the Ukrainians will still be able to hold some bridgeheads inside the urban area, perhaps manned by Spec Ops operatives, and resupply these units with small boats or pontoon bridges. That's why the Russian Army Command is trying to accelerate the defeat of the Ukrainian grouping in Kupyansk by bypassing all their defensive positions and bastions via amphibious operations both north and south of the city. If the Ukrainians cannot manage to eliminate these bridgeheads, in that case, anytime soon, Russian troops could be attacking the west bank of Kupyansk and thus force a complete withdrawal for the Ukrainian garrison. And the first step in this direction will be the capture of Dvorchina, which will be used as forward operating base for the Russian armed forces. Of course, in order to prevent this, General Syrsky will most likely transfer urgent reinforcements to the north of Kupyansk. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.